wonderful. I think it is sharing as we speak. What does transcription do?
So, are people seeing my screen?
Yes, we are.
Okay. So, thank you so much for the invitation, and I'm sad not to be there in person, but very happy to be giving this talk. So, imagine the front of your house or apartment building. Now, count the windows. So I'll give you a moment to do that little exercise. Now, most people, when they do this, many of them, close their eyes, and some even point to parts of space to keep track of the places that they've counted, the windows that they've counted. So the question is, where were you when I asked you to imagine? Well, you were sitting on your chair. But where were you when you were counting? Now, you were probably in a definite place in your imagined space. You were at the edge of the experienced space, and in that space you were counting. You might have had to move back in space in order to see all the windows, for example, if it's a big house. So there are two characters here. There is the you I asked to do the imagination exercise, and there was you who was located in the imagined space when you were counting. So this is a distinction between you imagining and you imagined. And the important point is that the imagined you is part of the imagined space, whereas the imagining you is part of real space. So if you look at Raphael's School of Athens, you, the viewer, are in the Vatican standing in front of the painting. But you, an implicit viewer, are in the painting. You more or less know where you are. You know that you are in front of those two pillars that are supporting the arch, because you can see the front. And presumably you're standing on the floor, and your height is roughly the height of that horizontal line, which is the horizon, actually. And you are looking at that white spot, which, as we will see in a moment, is the vanishing point of the perspective. So I am drawing an analogy between the imagining you, the viewer, and the imagined you, namely the implicit viewer in the painting. So my talk will consist of a few parts. First, I will talk about perspective, which is essential to understanding my argument. Then we will talk about eye height. Then we will talk about the implicit viewer. And then we will cover 3 examples of applications of the implicit viewer to works of art. One to a painting, a fresco by Mantegna, one a painting by Tintoretto, and one cartone by Goya, a preparation for a tapestry. So, how do you get a picture in perspective? Well, Leonardo invented what is called the perspectograph. And it's a piece of glass on which you can mark what you're seeing, and a board in which there's a small hole through which you look at the object through the mirror. And the way Leonardo describes this is the things approach the point of the eye in pyramids. And these pyramids are intersected on the glass plane. So let me explain. The vertical slab can be treated as Leonardo's mirror. There's a hexagonal object lying down, and on this vertical slab, you see an image. And the lines that go from the eye of the observer to corners of the hexagon, of the octagon, intersect the picture plane at corresponding points and create a picture in perspective. So the picture plane divides space into the space of the artist and the scene. And we assume, in general, that the picture plane is vertical. The point of the eye is called the center of projection. The line perpendicular to the canvas or the mirror or the glass or the slab, the picture plane, is called the principal ray, and it is orthogonal to the picture plane. In other words, it's horizontal, it's parallel to the floor. Now, if you look at the object in virtual space or in object space, you see 2 highlighted lines, and they are orthogonal to the picture plane, which is why they're called orthogonals. So these are virtual lines orthogonal to the picture plane. Now, these projected orthogonals, which now you see on the picture plane, they converge, and they converge onto what is called the principal vanishing point. Now, there are other sets of parallel lines, for example, those marked in green. And when you have parallel horizontal lines, their images also converge, but they converge on a secondary vanishing point. All possible vanishing points is a collection called the horizon line. So that's a quick crash course in the foundations of perspective. When you have a picture in perspective, you want to be able to reconstruct what the object was by looking at the picture. And this is called the inverse problem of perspective, to reconstruct the virtual space from the picture. And sometimes this is not trivial. Let's look at a very simple example. This is a photograph of a seascape. Now, This is a seascape with a low horizon. This, and ask yourself how you can get that. What do you have to do with the camera to get that picture, a low horizon? Or you can have a high horizon. What do you have to do to get a higher horizon? Well, that's ambiguous, because you can get it either by tilting the camera. So if you have a low horizon, you're tilting the camera up. And if you have a high horizon, you're tilting the camera down. So but that's just one way to achieve it. Another one is you can crop. You can take, in fact, this is what I did. I took the original picture and I cropped the bottom on the left and I cropped the top on the right, and you can't tell the difference. So sometimes the inverse problem can't be solved. But if you have parallel verticals, the problem becomes easier. So this is the first skyscraper in New York. And in both cases on the left, you see the verticals parallel to each other. And that means that the camera is level and that the picture plane is vertical. So if you think of the back of the camera as the picture plane is vertical when the axis of the camera is horizontal. On the right, you see what happens when the camera is tilted. The parallel verticals now converge. But when you have these parallels, something very interesting happens. You also know your eye height. On the left, you can tell that you're more or less at ground level. On the right, you can tell that your eye height is elevated. You must be standing on a high floor of a building across from this level where this line is horizontal, more or less. And that's the horizon at that point. So what you get from a picture in perspective is knowledge of the eye height. But whose eye height? Well, it's the eye height of the implicit viewer. The picture gives that eye height. And what's extraordinarily interesting is we feel that it's our eye height. Just like when you were imagining a scene, you were in the scene. When you have the sense of your eye height in the picture, you feel that you are there. You're in the scene. You are standing in a building across from this skyscraper, and you feel that it's your eye height. So the implicit viewer is not in real space together with you. The implicit viewer is in virtual space. The implicit viewer is in the picture. The implicit viewer is at the edge of the virtual space. It is a virtual eye, a virtual viewer, an implicit viewer that is implied by the picture at the height of the horizon, at the nearest edge of the virtual space. Now, when you see a picture in perspective, you can scale things relative to eye height. For example, the column here is, the column here has a height that is 2.17, the eye height, which is at the horizon. On the other hand, the pillar on the right, even though in the picture it's smaller, it's 3.7 times eye height, so it's taller. And if you look at the picture on the left, you'll see that indeed the impression is that it's taller. But that's relative information. This does not tell you how tall you are, that is, where absolutely your eye height is. So you need a familiar object. For instance, this airplane. And you feel that you may be standing in front of this airplane, looking at it. But then, when a familiar object appears, you suddenly realize that you had misscaled the object, because now there are people who you use as a reference scale, and this now becomes, the airplane becomes a model airplane. So, what is the relationship between the implicit viewer and the viewer? Well, Leonardo da Vinci, who did not distinguish between the two, of course, said the following: "It is impossible that your perspective should not look wrong unless the spectator, that is the viewer, has his eye at the very distance and height and direction where the eye or the point of sight, the center of projection, was placed in doing this perspective." But now, was Leonardo right? Well, he was partially right. So imagine yourself looking at a picture through a tube. Now, when you look at a picture through a tube, you lose the sense of the surface of the picture. And so when you do that, from anywhere other than the center of projection, it will indeed look wrong. And Lagauderie in 1859 showed us why. If you see this violet dot, that is where a spectator might stand looking at this picture of an alleyway. That dot is across from the center of projection. And so if you look here, when you're standing here at this distance, then the alleyway looks fine, rectangular. But if you move to the left and look at the picture through the tube, the alleyway will not look right. What were right angles now become oblique. And if you not only move to the left, but move further to the left and further away, then the virtual scene becomes stretched in depth and distorted. So to that extent, Leonardo was right. And this notion has been confirmed in experiments in the past century amply, that this indeed is what happens. Let me give you an example that is vivid of what happens when you cannot see the surface. So the reason we used the tube is to restrict our view, and the consequence is that the surface is invisible. And that means that we are not able to see the scene properly. Now, this is a painting by Andrea Pozzo in a church in Rome, the Church of St. Ignatius in Rome, in which he painted a fresco on the ceiling. And the ceiling is very far up. And so the surface of the ceiling itself is invisible. When you look at it, standing in the middle of the nave on a yellow marble disc that Pozzo had placed there, you are at the center of projection. And looking up, this glorious scene of ascent to heaven is very strikingly three-dimensional. Not only that, but this is a real window, and this is a painted window. And you can see they seamlessly blend into each other. And it looks strikingly three-dimensional. When you look at it, you cannot really tell the difference between the real window and the painted window. Now, if you move away from the center of projection, the columns become distorted. You can see that this column is not aligned with these columns. So this is the same distortion that I was referring to when I talked about looking through the tube. So when you cannot see the surface, you do not have an implicit viewer. The only viewer that you have is you. The implicit viewer exists only when there are cues to where the viewer is and you can see the surface, which means that you, the real viewer, can move anywhere you want in front of the painting, and the implicit viewer will not move. In other words, the implicit viewer is implicit in the painting, and the implicit viewer's location is fixed, even though you, the empirical viewer, may move around. This I've called in my book, I called the robustness of perspective. So let's take 3 examples of this story. Example 1. This is an example of the implicit viewer disagreeing with the real viewer. So this is a fresco in Padova, in the Eremitani Chapel, by Mantegna, and it's a painting of St. James led to execution. Now, let's analyze this painting. First of all, let's look at the arch. The facade must be parallel to the picture plane because the verticals do not converge. So we now know that the camera, there's no camera here, but the imagined camera, is looking straight at the scene. There's a pavement that is invisible. So if you look at the bottom of the picture, the feet of the characters are cut off. But what is happening to the implicit viewer? Well, the implicit viewer because his or her line of sight is perpendicular to the picture plane. We know that from my earlier review of perspective. The implicit viewer is looking at the feet of the people. This may seem paradoxical, but it's implicit in the picture. Remember, the picture plane is vertical because the verticals of the arch are vertical. The line of sight, or the principal ray, must be perpendicular to the column, to the arch. And if you look at these lines here, they all converge to a point at the bottom. In other words, the implicit viewer is doing something very strange. The implicit viewer is looking straight ahead along the pavement that we cannot see. But you, the viewer, are not interested in the feet of the protagonists, of the characters. You are interested in what's happening here, where there's drama, there is a faithful who is kneeling in front of the saint, and the saint is blessing him. There is a Roman soldier. There is someone accompanying him. This is where what is happening is happening. That's what you're interested in.
We cannot see the cursor.
Sorry, you cannot
just
see.
Tell us, if it's important, tell us where.
Oh,
where
okay, sorry. All right. That's too bad. Well, okay. So thank you for telling me. So if you follow the coffered ceiling inside the arch, sort of trace it, you can see that those lines converge, and I can tell you they converge at the bottom of the painting, of the fresco. So the vanishing point is at the floor. And as I said, the line of sight, the principal ray, must be perpendicular to the picture plane. And that means that the implicit viewer is looking at the feet of the characters. But you, the real viewer, you're interested in St. James. So on the left, I've divided the space into real space and virtual space. I've represented the pavement, I've represented the arch, and I've represented St. James. The viewer, you, are interested in the scene around St. James, but the implicit viewer is looking at the feet. That disjunction, which the reasons for which I have some ideas, but we don't have any direct evidence, so I'm not going to go into it, but the effect that it creates is a tension, a very interesting sort of tension between your implicit viewer, who is in the picture and is telling you where you, the implicit viewer, you, is looking. So that's one example. Let me give you a second example. This is again an implicit viewer who disagrees with the viewer, but in a very different way and even more interestingly. So this is a painting by Tintoretto called The Washing of the Feet. It's in the Prado, and it's huge. It's, if I'm not mistaken, it's about 15 meters wide and I don't know, maybe 3 meters tall. It's enormous. Now, the viewer's focus is on Jesus washing the feet of his disciples. That's the interesting part. But Tintoretto did the following. He placed the horizon where I placed the yellow dotted dashed line. And the vanishing point is in the middle of that arch, which is of no intrinsic interest. In other words, the implicit viewer is looking at a point that is almost as far away as possible from Jesus on the opposite side. Now, there's one other thing that you can tell from this picture, which is interesting. What is the eye height? Well, the eye height is roughly the eye height of the apostles sitting at the table with the white tablecloth. So what does that tell you about the implicit viewer? It tells us more than just the height of the implicit viewer's eye. It also tells you that the implicit viewer is probably sitting. Because either the implicit viewer is very short or the implicit viewer is sitting, and presumably that's. Now, what we do not know is whether psychologically there's an effect of that as well as the knowledge of the implicit viewer's eye height. It's possible, but we don't know. And it may be very difficult to establish experimentally. My third example is the notion of multiple implicit viewers. This is a cartoon or a cartone that Goya painted in preparation for a possible tapestry. Now, this represents a social critique of a custom that was prevalent in late 18th century Spain. If a young woman was widowed and she did not have a fortune, she needed to remarry. And very often she was forced to remarry an elderly and perhaps ugly man. So you can see the bride in her blue dress, and you can see an ape-like man in the brick-colored coat standing behind her. So this wedding procession has many details that I'm not going to go into. But I'd like you to notice that there is perspective here. So if you look at the wall on the right that is perpendicular to the arch, you can see that the lines converge, presumably onto a vanishing point. If you look at the stones lying down in the foreground, the slabs, they too are in perspective, and they too converge. And finally, if you look on the left of the bridge, you see orthogonals that they don't converge very well, but they suggest perspective. also with a vanishing point. So these three vanishing points are inconsistent. You have a horizon line that is consistent. There's society, the wall on the right, which I take to represent society, that is supporting this whole ceremony, is pointing in one direction. The slabs on the floor I interpret as representing the groom, and the vanishing point is pointing into the opening of the arch, which I hypothesize may be representing the bride. And so the bridge representing the bride also has vanishing points, not perfect, but also has vanishing points, and they are separate from the other two. So this is very interesting. This is a case where you can either say you alternate between implicit viewers, or you can say that this inconsistent perspective erases the existence of an implicit viewer. I'm inclined to think that you can think of this best as multiple conflicting implicit viewers. So those are my three examples. So I'd like to summarize. So we distinguished between the viewer of a painting and an implicit viewer entailed by the painting. We saw how artists use disjunctions between them to achieve aesthetic effects. And finally, we looked at a previously unexamined parallel between imagining and looking at paintings. And they both have implicit agents. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thanks a lot, Michael.
So, Heiko, can you undo or do you want to leave the screen on in case there are questions?
Let's leave it on for now, and let's ask questions. Niklas.
Yeah, thank you very much for this very interesting talk. I'd love to hear your opinion on a very special kind of images or pictures, namely the photography of outer space, a realm where we first of all struggle with taking a perspective because there is of course no up and down in space, and of course we don't have any clue of the dimensions depicted when we see nebulas or star formations that are 10, 15 or 1,000 light years wide or deep, and would this be some example where the implicit viewer is me, the real viewer, because there are no surface features, or what are your thoughts on this?
I agree. I think that when you have a picture on a vast scale that is not in perspective and does not give you clues as to where you are in a sense lost in space. You presumably localize the implicit viewer in the middle, but that's just by default. I don't think that there's a strong implicit viewer. I think that there's even maybe when you are lost in space in that way, you get a sense of the vastness of what you're looking at. But yeah, I think that that's what I would guess.
Yeah, just like a Jackson Pollock. Klaus.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Michael, for this wonderful talk. I have one question that has two parts. One is, are people so naive observers? Are they aware of such inconsistencies in perspective? And second, is it a special aesthetic appeal if you find out or feel this inconsistency? So you know, I'm particularly interested in these this slow perception, this aesthetic pleasing
Yes.
perception, not only, you know, fluent processing which is nice maybe, but I'm interested in exactly what you're also describing as, you know, there's inconsistency and maybe therefore it's possible to focus on several things and you could even make a narrative out of it in time and so on, because there's a implicit feeling that something is wrong and so you focus differently. Do you know any research on that? I have started research on shadows, inconsistency of shadows. And what we found out is people have no idea that it is inconsistent and they cannot really recognize it. They can even not implicitly. So they are really mainly focusing on the central point, and so they say, okay, this is about where the light comes from and where's the shadow and so on. So yeah.
Yes, I think that's a wonderful question. And first of all, I don't think there's a clear answer from what we know. But let me tell you, this kind of conversation I've been having with Judith, my wife, who's a composer, for many, many years. That is, she understands music from the inside. She understands the structure. She understands exactly what the composer is doing when the composer is misleading you or creating certain expectations. I am not knowledgeable enough. And so the question is, what is gained and what is lost by a deeper understanding of any work of art? My impression is from the fields that I have studied, for instance, for many years, I've been interested in symmetry patterns, in two-dimensional symmetry patterns, sometimes very complex. And when we visited the Alhambra, which has all of these wonderful tiling patterns and beautiful geometric designs, when I came to look at this, I already had a background in understanding the mathematics of these structures. And thanks to this understanding, I was able to see the virtuosity, the cleverness, the ingenuity that I think I would not have noticed were it not for this knowledge. Now, you ask about the naive viewer. We, of course, don't know, but we certainly know that the naive viewer may need guidance to have various aspects of the work of art understood. Clearly, there's some preconditions for the knowledge or the understanding of any work of art. You have to be sort of immersed in the culture that created it to some extent. You have to know the conventions. So there are some preconditions, but I suspect that most people would perhaps feel a tension rather than know exactly what is going on. So the Tintoretto was pointed out to me by my son, who had been on a trip to Spain. And he said to me, look at this is amazing. And we worked through it together. And there are many things that he and his friends had not noticed because they were not knowledgeable about perspective. But it was a painting that they were fascinated by, probably because of the inconsistency. So that's the most I can, the most solid answer I can give.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks a lot.
Michael, I would like to take issue with your concept of an implicit viewer.
Okay.
So there is the good old disembodied I, which I like a lot. So basically, I think this comes out to be the same as your implicit viewer. So here I am in front of the picture, and now I take a step to the side, and yeah, the gallery is still pointing the same way relative to me. I could think of this as an implicit viewer just staying where I just used to be. So right. I basically create this avatar of myself. I move to the side, and another copy of myself remains in front of the picture, i.e. the implicit viewer. And of course, where I remain is the artist's decision, as you pointed out so nicely. When I sort of think of this in terms of an implicit viewer, I have another I, another person there. Whereas if I think of this as a disembodied I, I'm maintaining the connection to myself. And since I have two eyes, or as we have heard, maybe with enhanced bodies 4, some in the back as well, and so on. So I think it's easier to make the mental move to have two disembodied eyes, maybe. And they're still somehow linked to my body. So is there, or do you have good arguments why we should use the metaphor of an implicit viewer rather than of a disembodied eye?
Well, that's really a wonderful question, Heiko. It's a very challenging question. I reached the conclusion that the implicit viewer is in the picture. I reached that conclusion only quite recently. And I think that the idea of, if you look at the picture of the skyscraper where you're at an elevated position, it seems to me that the phenomenology of that experience is not of having someone next to you, but rather being somewhere. In other words, there's an element of embodiment, I think, that is a different body, because it is scaled to the features of the scene, not scaled to the features of real space. In other words, your eye height in the picture is absolutely determined by familiar objects and relatively determined by the horizon height. But that implicit size or implicit height, the distance of your implicit eye or implicit viewer from the floor, is entirely scaled in the picture. In other words, it is not an inhabitant of real space. So, what convinced me also is this story about imagining. That is the idea that an act of imagining is not looking at an image, but enacting an act of counting in your imagination. See, the metaphor that psychologists use of mental imagery and scanning the mental image is misleading, precisely because the psychologist is unwilling to violate Occam's razor and create more experiencing entities than may be absolutely necessary. But I think that the experience of being there in your act of imagining is exactly the kind of thing that I have in mind, because really when you're imagining, you are in front of your house. So that's the best answer I can give. I don't think that that I can give any stronger proof, but I'm quite convinced by the phenomenology.
Okay, thanks. I think I see your point. I mean, it's always about relating the virtual space to the real space, and I guess depending on what you emphasize, whether it is the action of the observer in real space versus the immersion into the virtual space, you could.
Let me make a point about that. Yes, Heiko, we've talked about this back and forth often. And I think there are two topics in this field that need to be kept separate. One of them is the question of how do you see the layout of the virtual world without relation to the real world? The second, which is a question that you've been more interested in, is what do things in the virtual world point to in the real world? I'm leaving that topic aside. That is a fascinating topic, and you've done wonderful work on it. But it seems to me that if we really are talking about the layout of the virtual world, then my point of view about the virtual viewer becomes stronger, because then you're not dealing with a relationship with the real world inhabited by the real viewer.
Okay, I see that. So in a virtual reality, the implicit viewer then becomes explicit to some extent. Okay, we should let Niklas ask the next question.
Yeah, this is also something I thought about the last couple of minutes, like who is the implicit viewer, in terms of which features does he or she possess in relation to me, the actual viewer. And coming back to the question asked by Professor Carbon, I was instantaneously reminded of the works of Edward Hopper, who, for me at least, really mastered the playing with the implicit viewer and the creating the tension in a picture and playing with slightly disordered perspectives. And at least when I look at a painting of Hopper, I immediately feel a certain type of loneliness crawling my back. And I think it's some sort, maybe some sort of sensomotoric simulation, in terms that I feel I'm immersed in the picture. I feel that I am looking at the scenery, but of course I have a phenomenological experience which is not necessarily must relate to my position in real space. Maybe if I'm in a museum and I'm accompanied by my family or my friends, I'm certainly not lonely, but while looking at the picture, I feel lonely. And I think there has always be a certain connection to me as a real viewer, but of course, due to my past experiences maybe in scenes similar like that, I can feel the feelings of the implicit viewer in this particular image.
Yeah, really interesting. So I unfortunately have never, I know that Hopper painted in perspective, but I never actually tried to reconstruct the perspective that he uses. So I have no doubt that most of us will agree with you about the atmosphere of loneliness and perhaps even of despair that is conveyed by Hopper, by many Hopper pictures. But is it because of the location of an implicit viewer? So I'm not proposing that we use the notion of an implicit viewer in all cases of analysis of a painting. I'm not sure that wouldn't dilute the idea. So the implicit viewer is made implicit by cues in the structure of the picture. And if there is a consistent construction and the vanishing point is more or less in the middle of the picture, then that sort of subtracts the role of the implicit viewer from the whole process, because the implicit viewer is sort of a default, not particularly interesting. It's the cases where we deviate that the implicit viewer becomes aesthetically interesting. So after sometime later today, I'm going to look at Hopper, and maybe you could send me an email and maybe we could discuss. I could look at the perspective and see whether there's something. I mean, it could be really fascinating. But thank you for the question.
Klaus.
Yeah. Another question. Michael, think of the following observer. He or she has hardly any mental imagery. A person that can, of course, look at the picture, can also see, maybe even feel what the implicit viewer, which position he or she takes. Okay, this is clear. That has nothing to do with imagination or imagery, but this person has no capability of imagery. And you know, there are people who have no imagery. Yes, we have researched about 100 persons with hardly any visual imagery, and many things do not work at all. So, for example, they cannot assess distinctiveness of faces, but they can assess, for example, attractiveness of faces, because attractiveness for me from that moment on was very clear. It's a relatively superficial visual cueing thing. It's not this idea that you have to imagine what a beautiful face is, because obviously they cannot. But here it's quite interesting because they can see where they stand as a virtual or an implicit viewer, but they cannot imagine it, you know, to be there, which is quite interesting.
I think that's such an interesting notion that, I mean, you're taking my parallel more seriously than I did. That is, you're asking whether indeed imagining and looking at paintings have some commonality.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know, it would be really wonderful to try to find out whether those individuals have, for instance, if you showed them the two views of the skyscraper and you asked them, where are you? I would have trouble imagining, I would have trouble thinking that they would not be able to tell you that one is a view from the street and the other is from an elevated point of view. But if they can't, that would be quite a discovery.
We'll find it out.
Okay.
Let's connect.
Okay, Judith?
Yes, so I'm also a fan of Hopper's paintings, but I think that they actually are captivating from the point of view of implicit viewer. So I was just looking at The House by the Railroad from 1925. It's kind of a scary picture, and the implicit viewer. Can I share my screen to show this?
Yeah, try it. To see if I can.
Or Michael, maybe you can.
Well, try to share your screen.
Should work.
Should
work.
Michael's
I'm looking
presentation.
On the top right, left of the leaf. So there's a share. This arrow towards heaven.
On, well, top right, I don't have anything, but I have the three dots with more actions.
Then you don't have the red leave button? Right to it should be a share icon.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, I don't want to waste the time, but it's a very large house and it is cut off towards the bottom by railroad tracks. And clearly the viewer has to be below looking up at this. And in all of his pictures, I don't know about all, I'm no expert, but they are cut off in very fascinating ways. For one, another one is called Chop Suey, and in that one, because the bottom of the picture, it's as though these are cut, and they position the the implicit viewer in such striking ways. But I think that there's also a contrast between what you're perceiving in terms of loneliness is
That's it?
viewer can either support or contradict that. So it's in these paintings, it's so strongly emphasizing aspects of the content where you can't be there positionally yourself. So there's, to me, also a strong intimation of the idea of camera gaze, a kind of internal camera gaze. So anyhow, fascinating that you brought up the Hopper. And I think that the idea of implicit viewer is particularly important in them.
So let's leave that up because it's a fascinating picture. First of all, you're looking at the house over a barrier, a stone barrier or something that is hiding the bottom of the house.
It's the railroad. It's the railroad.
Oh, I see. You're under the railroad. I see.
Yeah.
Okay, I understand now. So you have a very low vantage point, and clearly this is not a simple, the building is not set in a frontal position. So the verticals are vertical, but the faces, the sides of the house are oblique. And so you have vanishing points to the right and to the left in what is called two-point perspective. And when you have this kind of situation, actually knowing where the virtual or the implicit viewer is becomes more difficult, because there is no vanishing point inside the picture. The vanishing points are to the right and to the left. So, in fact, this is such an interesting example that I never thought about, that what happens when you turn the scene 45 or 30 degrees so that none of the planes are orthogonal or parallel to the picture plane. I think that that's a way of losing one's position in space. You really don't know. You only know the eye height, but you don't know where the implicit viewer is right to left, I think, or at best, at a default in the middle.
So I think Judith is was the next one. Yeah. Judith?
Oh, I already made my comment, but I think it's fascinating because here there's also a sense, but maybe this is content and maybe part of it is perceptual. This house looks like there's something the matter with it. Maybe it's sinking or something. The windows look sort of a bit out of kilter, especially the ones on top. Yeah. So it's just, to me, fascinating how the structural components and the content, what the interaction is between those two things. And I think that's why, to me, the idea of this implicit viewer is so fascinating, because the artist has the opportunity to use those to build something that creates an interaction between the content and the structure, which is something I'm very familiar with in music as well. And just one last thing, I think, I know I'm no art historian. I'm just, sort of a naive viewer looking at this. There is, I'm sure, much more to be experienced when you do have the tools for it. But that is not to say that you can't have a rich experience without those.
Yeah, wonderful. Klaus?
Yeah. So of course I like this idea with implicit viewer, but also I would would like to make clear that here we shouldn't overestimate it, because with Hopper it's always this non-reachable thing. So it's always this frozenness. Yeah. We see a situation that is not lively, never ever. Here it's very clear not lively, but even if you see characters like in the bar and so on, they are, they are not interacting. They are standing still, and we never can reach them. There's always glass in between or a barrier like the railroad. So there is this implicit viewer, yes, but also this very intense, very well done style that makes us believe that this is not reachable. This is not reachable, and it's frozen. It's like, there's no time in this whole painting. So additional, at least additional.
So I think what we need to do is merge Michael's theory of implicit viewer with the good old disembodied I theory. So we have here in the Hopper case, we have to resort, to canonical implicit viewer right in front of the picture, because the pictorial content doesn't reveal where the implicit viewer is supposed to be. Same with other pictures. Imagine a smiley, two dots, a nose, a mouth, and a circle around it. Just a very simple smiley. There is this effect that you always look at this as if you were in front of the picture. So the implicit viewer is in front of the picture, but there's nothing in the pictorial information that reveals whether there is a horizon or anything. There's nothing there, and still you get the typical pictorial effects, the Mona Lisa effect, and so on. So I think the implicit viewer is sort of by default hovering in front of the picture as specified in real space by the outline of the rectangular canvas. And then if you add information of the pictorial kind in the picture that's suggestive of the vanishing point, of a viewpoint or several viewpoints, then the implicit viewer is shifted away from the default into the pictorial realm, which I think is very fascinating. So, Michael, would you be willing to go along with that and say we need to refine the implicit viewer theory, and maybe we can work together on one that sort of satisfies all of these types of pictures?
For the sake of peace, I'm willing to compromise.
Okay, it's a deal.
But I need to think about it, and we need to talk about it more, because I want to understand better the disembodied I and what its function is in your thinking before I know how to merge them. So it's not clear, not because I think that it's wrong, but because I'm not sure I understand all the ramifications of the combination.
Yeah, neither am I, but this is definitely something we should pursue. Judith, is your hand still up from the last time, or is this a new question?
I'm trying to get rid of it, but just let me say one thing, and that is, why isn't the implicit viewer below the railroad tracks? Why aren't we looking up at this?
We're not looking up because the verticals are parallel. So we are looking at a scene with a, well, I'd have to do the reconstruction of the perspective
Yeah, it may be an impossible figure, right? The two perspectives, the horizon and the house may not match.
Here's where you can start figuring it out. Where's the horizon? Well, when you have lines that are not converging anymore, but are horizontal, like look on the left, the two windows just above the railroad track. The crossbars in the windows are almost horizontal. So that must be where the horizon is. So the person is standing in a ditch, looking just above the tracks.
Yeah, exactly.
At that level of the window. And that's a very strange place to be.
And not only a strange place to be, but also a strange view to be, because it's exactly what Judith said. And typically, you would, you are below this ditch. You are, of course, looking up, and you would see it very differently. It's very strange to look at the ditch, from this close distance. So, yeah.
Yeah, I think the more we talk about this, the more I think that the notion of an implicit viewer might come in handy here, but I don't know yet.
Okay, Niklas?
Yeah, maybe this is what makes Hopper so special, what Professor Carbon said, like this reachability, and what you said about being lost in space, but not outer space in this particular case, but in this space where we are feeling this irritation of, okay, I have a feeling where I should be, but it doesn't work out for me. And therefore I'm always like thinking about where am I, where are these persons, not in this case, but in the pictures where he draw some persons. But this was not my initial question or my comment. I'm very inclined to stretch the notion of the implicit viewer a little bit farther away from perceptual psychology, which is of course very empirically very solid discipline, but maybe perspective from psychoanalysis would also help us, because there is this notion in psychoanalysis which was elaborated by Lacan very much about the ideal ego and the ego ideal. And the ideal ego refers to a place in space, or a place where the subject feels likable, and the ego ideal is the perspective from which this particular space is constituted. It's of course a much more philosophical and psychoanalytic point, but we may even ask, okay, when this applies to each and every one of us, is there not something similar to the implicit viewer in terms of being that there is a virtual observer which looks at us and to which we apply in whatever he or she or it is, like as if we would be in a painting that is viewed by an outside observer.
So my hesitation is that I would like to keep concepts to be applicable only when they're really called for, rather than to see how far they can stretch. And I can see why you would want to do what you've been talking about, and it's not unreasonable. But from my methodological point of view, I want to be conceptually modest rather than to propose concepts that have a very wide scope, because they become much less precise when they're detached from strong phenomenology and clear structural aspects of the painting.
Yeah, I completely understand. I just wanted to emphasize how this idea of a virtual observer, which is not ourselves, also resonates in other schools of
Absolutely,
thought.
absolutely.
Okay, maybe for a final question, Klaus?
Yeah, not a question, but I want to, I now stop the sharing, but I want to share another picture by Hopper. So we are now very Hopperian, but that is so interesting to see the lighthouse from 29. So because it's exactly this strange view to the, to the hill, not up the hill, what we would never do. Typically we don't do this. And again, it's a very, very strange feeling. Yeah. And I think it's really because we are not used to this. Typically, it's this profit idea, this Dennis profit idea that we always, we are on the way. We think implicitly what resources we need and so on. And so typically we look up and we look down if it's going up or down and nothing else. So of course, sometimes there are, landscapes that are a long time horizontal and then go up, and therefore we have this view. But typically we are on a hill more longer than just before the hill and then going up. So, and here it's the same. For me, it's very, very interesting.
It is a wonderful example. And again, he's using two-point perspective.
Exactly.
Which is disorienting. Well,
yeah,
wonderful.
Yeah, that was very productive.
Yes.
Okay, I stop the sharing. Is it okay? Yeah.
Sure. Great picture. What is it called? Lighthouse or something like
Lighthouse
that?
29. Yeah.
29. Okay. Wonderful. Well, thank you, Michael, so much for this really inspiring talk. We will keep the discussion going, I'm sure. I thank everybody else for listening in, and I will let you know, Michael, if the recording has worked out, and then I'll sort of compress the file and then somehow make it accessible. Okay, it was great to see everybody, and thanks again, Michael. Applause.
Thank you. You were really such a wonderful audience. Fascinating questions. Thank you very much.
All right, take care, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye, and thanks for the invitation. Bye-bye. Bye.